The morning started off sketchy as hell in downtown Detroit, and Marcus Washington could feel it in his bones before anything even went down. He was pulling a double shift at County General Hospital, exhausted from 12 hours of dealing with the usual Friday night chaos, when the first wave of patients started rolling in. At first, nobody thought much of it, just another batch of strung-out junkies or folks who got into bad batches of street drugs, but Marcus had been an ER nurse for 15 years, and something about these cases felt different, felt wrong. The patients came in convulsing, their eyes bloodshot and wild, foam dripping from their mouths as they thrashed against the gurneys with strength that shouldn't have been possible for people in their condition. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, the attending physician who'd seen just about everything in her 20-year career, kept muttering under her breath that this wasn't any drug reaction she'd ever encountered. The victims weren't responding to any of the standard treatments, and their vitals were all over the place, heart rates spiking to dangerous levels before suddenly flattening, then somehow jumping back to life again like nothing Marcus had ever witnessed. By noon, the hospital was absolutely swamped, and that's when things really started going sideways. Marcus was in the middle of trying to restrain a middle-aged woman who'd come in an hour earlier when she suddenly stopped breathing, her heart monitor going flatline despite all their efforts to revive her. He'd called it, pulling the sheet over her face with that heavy feeling he never quite got used to, no matter how many times he'd had to do it. He was turning to check on the next patient when he heard this god-awful sound behind him, like bones cracking and joints popping all at once. The dead woman was sitting up, the sheet falling away from her face, but her eyes were completely white now, no iris, no pupil, just this milky nothingness that made his stomach drop. Before he could even process what he was seeing, she lunged at him with a speed that didn't make any kind of sense, her teeth snapping inches from his throat as he stumbled backward, crashing into a medical cart. The sound of his yelling brought other staff running, but what they saw made everyone freeze in their tracks. The woman was moving like some kind of rabid animal, no recognition, no humanity left in those dead eyes, just pure hunger and aggression that seemed focused on one thing, getting to the living people in that room. Across town in the financial district, Jake Morrison was having what he thought would be just another boring day as a security guard at the Hendricks Tower, a 60-story office building that housed some of the biggest corporate names in the city. He was making his rounds on the 32nd floor, nodding at the desk workers who barely acknowledged his existence, when the power flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in that eerie red glow that always made him think of horror movies. The building's backup generators should have kicked in within seconds, but minutes passed and the main power stayed dead. Jake grabbed his radio, trying to reach his supervisor down in the main security office, but all he got was static and broken fragments of screaming. That's when he heard the commotion coming from the stairwell, the sound of dozens of footsteps thundering up the concrete stairs, accompanied by screams and shouts that were getting closer by the second. He moved toward the stairwell door, pressing his ear against it, and what he heard made his blood run cold. It wasn't just people running, it was chaos, pure panic, and underneath it all was this horrible wet sound, like meat being torn, and these awful gurgling moans that didn't sound human at all. The stairwell door exploded outward, and a flood of people burst onto the 32nd floor, office workers in their business casual clothes, their faces twisted in terror as they ran like their lives depended on it. Jake tried to stop someone, anyone, to figure out what the hell was happening, but they just shoved past him, knocking him against the wall. Then he saw why they were running. Following behind the fleeing workers was a group of maybe 20 people, but calling them people felt wrong because something fundamental had changed in them. They moved with this jerky, unnatural gait, their clothes torn and stained with blood, their mouths hanging open as they released these bone-chilling moans. Several of them were clearly injured, injuries that should have put them down for good, but they kept coming, kept moving forward with single-minded purpose. One man had a chunk of his neck missing, the wound gaping and raw, but he didn't seem to notice or care as he lurched forward, his arms outstretched toward the fleeing workers. Jake's training kicked in, and he reached for his radio again, managing to get through to someone, anyone, and what he heard confirmed his worst fears. The entire city was going to hell, and whatever was happening here in Hendricks Tower was happening everywhere. Meanwhile, in the suburban neighborhood of Riverside Park, about 20 miles from downtown, high school teacher Amanda Foster was in the middle of a Saturday morning run when she noticed something was off. The streets were usually pretty quiet this early, just a few other joggers and people walking their dogs, but today there was this weird tension in the air, like everyone was on edge. She passed old Mr. Peterson walking his golden retriever, and instead of his usual friendly wave, he hurried past her with his head down, practically dragging the confused dog behind him. Amanda was about to head back home when she heard the sirens, dozens of them, all wailing at once from the direction of the city. She pulled out her phone to check the news and felt her heart sink as she read the headlines. Reports of violent attacks, people going crazy, hospitals overwhelmed, complete chaos spreading across the metropolitan area. The news sites were calling it a terrorist attack, some kind of biological weapon, but the details were sketchy and contradictory, and the comments sections were filled with people claiming it was something much worse, using words like infected and undead that seemed too crazy to be real. She was still reading when her neighbor, Danny Martinez, came running out of his house, his teenage daughter Cassidy right behind him. Danny was a former Marine, the kind of guy who always seemed prepared for anything, and the fact that he looked genuinely scared made Amanda's anxiety spike even higher. He was loading gear into his pickup truck, moving with quick efficiency, and when he saw Amanda standing there staring at her phone, he called out to her. "Amanda, you need to get inside, grab whatever supplies you can, and get ready to move. This ain't no drill, and it ain't gonna get better. I got buddies still on the force downtown, and what they're telling me is straight out of a nightmare. People are dying and then getting back up, and they're attacking anyone they can get their hands on. We got maybe a few hours before it spreads out here to the suburbs, and we need to be long gone before that happens." His words hit her like a physical blow, and she stood there for a second, trying to process the insanity of what he was saying, but the dead serious look in his eyes told her he wasn't joking, wasn't exaggerating, wasn't crazy. Back at County General Hospital, Marcus was in the middle of what could only be described as a war zone. The woman who'd died and come back had been locked in an empty room, but she wasn't alone anymore. 3 more patients had died and reanimated in the last 30 minutes, and the hospital security guards were completely overwhelmed trying to contain them. The remaining staff had barricaded themselves in the nurses' station, watching through the reinforced glass as the creatures that used to be their patients prowled the hallways, looking for a way in. Dr. Hayes was on the phone with the CDC, her voice getting more and more frustrated as whoever was on the other end apparently wasn't giving her the answers she needed. She finally slammed the phone down and looked at the assembled staff with an expression that was equal parts anger and fear. "They're telling me to maintain quarantine protocols and wait for backup, but they won't tell me what the hell we're actually dealing with here. They wouldn't confirm or deny whether this is happening in other cities, wouldn't give me any information about treatment or containment, just kept repeating the same bureaucratic nonsense about procedures and protocols." Marcus was trying to figure out their next move when he heard screaming coming from the floor above them. The intercom crackled to life, and a panicked voice came through, one of the nurses from the pediatric ward. "They're in the stairwells, they're everywhere, we're trapped up here with the kids, somebody please help us." The words sent a chill through everyone in the nurses' station because if those things had gotten into the stairwells, then the whole hospital was compromised, and there was no easy way out. Marcus made a decision right then and there, knowing that staying put meant dying. He grabbed the fire axe from the emergency case on the wall, feeling the weight of it in his hands, and looked at Dr. Hayes. "We gotta get to the pediatric ward, get those kids and whoever else we can, and find a way out of this building. Staying here, we're just sitting ducks waiting for those things to figure out how to get through these doors." Some of the staff looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but others, including Dr. Hayes, nodded in agreement because they all knew he was right. The group moved quickly, 6 staff members including Marcus and Dr. Hayes, armed with whatever improvised weapons they could grab, fire axes, for stands, anything that could be used to keep those creatures at bay. They moved down the hallway in a tight formation, and Marcus got his first real look at what they were up against. The reanimated corpses turned toward them as they approached, those dead white eyes locking onto the living with unmistakable hunger. There were maybe a dozen of them in the immediate area, some still in hospital gowns, others in street clothes, all of them moving with that same unnatural, jerky motion. The first one lunged at Marcus, and he swung the fire axe more on instinct than anything else, catching the creature in the shoulder. It barely slowed down, didn't react to what should have been a devastating injury, just kept coming at him. It wasn't until he swung again, this time connecting with the head, that the creature dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. The realization hit him hard, headshots only, just like in every zombie movie he'd ever watched, and the absurdity of that thought almost made him laugh despite the terror. They fought their way through the hallway, each step a brutal struggle, and Marcus watched as Jennifer Kim, one of the younger nurses, went down when she slipped on blood-slicked floor. Two of the creatures were on her before anyone could react, and her screams were cut short in a way that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life, however long that ended up being. They couldn't stop, couldn't help her, could only keep moving forward toward the stairwell and the pediatric ward above. By the time they reached the stairs, they were down to 4 people: Marcus, Dr. Hayes, an orderly named Travis Cooper, and another nurse named Michelle Rodriguez. They were all covered in blood, exhausted, and terrified, but they kept climbing because those kids upstairs were counting on them. At Hendricks Tower, Jake had managed to organize a group of survivors on the 45th floor, far enough above the initial outbreak that they'd had time to barricade the stairwell doors and assess their situation. There were about 30 people in total, a mix of office workers, a couple of security guards, and a maintenance supervisor named Bobby Chin who'd been working on the HVAC system when everything went crazy. Wait, scratch that, the maintenance supervisor was named Roy Patterson, and he was proving invaluable because he knew the building's layout better than anyone. They'd tried the elevators, but without main power and with the backup generators apparently offline, they were stuck using the stairs, and the stairs were filled with those things. Jake had been doing head counts, trying to keep everyone calm and focused, but panic was setting in as people realized they were trapped 60 stories up with no clear way down and no idea if help was coming. A corporate lawyer named Brenda Phillips had managed to get a call through to 911 before the cell towers got overwhelmed, and what the dispatcher told her before the line went dead wasn't encouraging. The entire metropolitan area was in chaos, emergency services were completely overwhelmed, and citizens were being advised to shelter in place and await further instructions. Shelter in place in an office building with no power, limited food and water, and a stairwell full of zombies didn't seem like a winning strategy to Jake, but he also didn't have any better ideas at the moment. They'd pushed filing cabinets and desks against the stairwell doors, and so far the barricades were holding, but they could hear those things on the other side, moaning and scratching, and occasionally the doors would shudder as the creatures threw themselves against it. One of the younger guys, a tech worker named Chris Bennett, had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. The building had a helipad on the roof, and while none of them could fly a helicopter, it at least got them thinking about the roof as a potential escape route or rescue point. The problem was getting from the 45th floor to the 60th floor with the stairwells compromised. Roy mentioned that there was a maintenance ladder running up the elevator shaft, used by technicians for servicing the elevator systems, and it would bypass the stairwells entirely. It was dangerous as hell, climbing 60 feet up a dark elevator shaft, but dangerous seemed a whole lot better than staying put and waiting to die. Jake volunteered to go first, test the route and see if it was even possible, and a former college athlete named Tyler Jackson insisted on going with him. They pried open the elevator doors on the 45th floor, revealing the dark shaft beyond, and Jake could feel the vertigo hit him as he looked down into the darkness below and up into the darkness above. The maintenance ladder was there, just like Roy said, a metal rungs bolted to the shaft wall. Taking a deep breath, Jake grabbed the first rung and started climbing, trying not to think about the hundreds of feet of empty space below him, or the fact that one wrong move meant a fall that would definitely kill him. Tyler was right behind him, and Jake could hear the other man's heavy breathing echoing in the confined space. They climbed in silence, counting floors as they passed the closed elevator doors, and Jake's arms were burning by the time they reached what should have been the 60th floor. Getting the roof access door open from the inside the elevator shaft was a whole different challenge, requiring Jake to balance precariously on the ladder while trying to force the emergency release. When the door finally gave way, flooding the shaft with gray daylight, Jake felt a surge of relief that was short-lived. He pulled himself out onto the roof access room and helped Tyler up, and they both took a moment to catch their breath before pushing through to the actual rooftop. What they saw when they emerged made their victory feel hollow. The city spread out below them in every direction, and it was burning. Dozens of fires sent columns of smoke into the gray sky, and even from 60 stories up, they could hear sirens, gunshots, and screams. Whatever was happening, it wasn't contained to their building or even their neighborhood. The whole city was falling apart, and Jake had the sinking feeling that this was happening everywhere, not just Detroit. Back in Riverside Park, Amanda had taken Danny's advice and grabbed everything useful from her house: food, water, first aid supplies, her camping gear from the garage, and her father's old hunting rifle with 2 boxes of ammunition. She'd never been much of a shooter, had only gone to the range a couple times with her dad before he passed, but she knew which end the bullets came out of, and that might be enough. Danny, Cassidy, and Amanda were joined by 2 more neighbors: Marcus Thompson, an IT specialist who lived 3 doors down with his wife and infant son, and Lisa Rodriguez, a nurse who'd just gotten off a night shift at a clinic across town. Lisa's report from the clinic matched what Danny's police contacts had told him: people dying, coming back, attacking anyone they could reach, and the infection or whatever it was spreading like wildfire through physical contact, through bites. The group had consolidated into Danny's house because it was the most defensible, a solid brick ranch with a reinforced basement that Danny had turned into a proper shelter years ago, complete with food stocks, water, and emergency supplies. His survivalist tendencies that the neighbors had always quietly joked about didn't seem so crazy now. They were in the basement going over their options when they heard the first screams from outside, close by, maybe just a few houses down. Cassidy, who'd been monitoring the police scanner, went pale and turned up the volume. The dispatcher's voice was barely controlled panic, reporting attacks all over Riverside Park, emergency services unable to respond to all the calls, advising people to lock their doors and defend themselves by any means necessary. That last part, defend themselves by any means necessary, was when Amanda truly understood that the government had lost control, that there was no cavalry coming to save them, that they were on their own. Danny started giving orders, his Marine training evident in the calm, authoritative way he organized their defense. Marcus Thompson was sent to reinforce the doors and windows on the first floor, using furniture and tools from Danny's well-stocked garage. Lisa began organizing medical supplies and creating a triage area in case anyone got injured. Cassidy, despite being only 16, was put in charge of communications, monitoring the police scanner, trying to get information from social media before the internet inevitably went down. Amanda found herself paired with Danny, and he was teaching her the basics of the AR-15 he was handing her, his hands steady as he showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to switch the safety on and off. Center mass doesn't work on these things, he told her, his eyes serious. Lisa says she saw one at the clinic take 4 rounds to the chest and keep coming. It's the head, always the head, that's the only thing that stops them for good. The first attack on Danny's house came just before dusk, and it wasn't the massive horde that Amanda had been imagining. It was Mr. Peterson from down the street, the same man she'd seen that morning walking his dog, except now he was one of them, his skin gray and mottled, his eyes that terrible milky white, his golden retriever nowhere to be seen. He threw himself against the front door again and again, and the sound of it echoed through the house like a drum. Danny watched through the reinforced peephole, his jaw tight, and Amanda could see the pain in his eyes because he'd known Peterson for 15 years, had gone to barbecues at his house, had helped him fix his roof last summer. But the thing outside wasn't Peterson anymore, and when two more of those creatures joined him, former neighbors whose names Amanda knew, Danny made the call. They couldn't let them break through, couldn't let them compromise the house's defenses. He opened the second-floor window directly above the front door and did what had to be done, each shot precise and final, and Amanda had to turn away because she couldn't watch people she'd known, even if they weren't really people anymore. At County General Hospital, Marcus and his group had finally reached the pediatric ward, and what they found broke his heart. The staff up there had managed to hold the line, creating a safe zone in the central play area, but they'd lost people doing it. There were 12 kids ranging from toddlers to teenagers, scared out of their minds, crying for parents who might not even be alive anymore. The nurse who'd called for help, Patricia Owens, was bleeding from a bite on her arm, and the way Dr. Hayes looked at that wound told Marcus everything he needed to know. Patricia knew it too, and she pulled Dr. Hayes aside, her voice low and urgent. "I know what this means, saw it happen to 3 other people already. You got maybe 30 minutes before I turn into one of those things. Use that time, get these kids out of here, and when I start to turn, you make sure I don't hurt anyone. Promise me." Dr. Hayes tried to argue, tried to say they didn't know for sure, but Patricia cut her off. "We both know, Rebecca. Just promise me." They gathered the kids, and Marcus did his best to keep them calm while organizing the evacuation. The original plan to use the stairwells was clearly out, with those things packed in there shoulder to shoulder from what they could hear through the doors. Their only option was the emergency fire escape on the outside of the building, accessed through a window in one of the patient rooms. It wasn't ideal, especially with young kids, but it was their only shot. Travis and Michelle started getting the kids ready, while Marcus and Dr. Hayes worked on securing their route. They were moving a bed to access the window when Patricia started showing symptoms, her skin going clammy, her eyes losing focus. True to her word, Dr. Hayes made sure Patricia didn't suffer, didn't turn into one of those monsters, and Marcus saw the tears streaming down the doctor's face even as her hands remained steady. The descent down the fire escape was a nightmare, the metal structure swaying under their weight, the kids crying and clinging to the adults, the sound of chaos from inside the hospital following them down. They were only on the 3rd floor when Marcus looked up and saw faces pressed against the windows above them, both living and dead, and he prayed that none of those things figured out how to open a window. They made it to the ground floor, and Marcus never thought he'd be so grateful to feel solid concrete under his feet. The hospital parking lot was a scene of absolute carnage, abandoned cars, blood, bodies both moving and still, and small groups of survivors trying to make their way to safety. Dr. Hayes pointed toward the emergency services building across the street, a reinforced structure that housed ambulances and emergency equipment, and they made a run for it, Marcus carrying a 4-year-old girl named Emma while Travis and Michelle herded the older kids. They burst into the emergency services building and found it already occupied by a group of paramedics and EMTs who'd barricaded themselves inside. The lead paramedic, a grizzled veteran named Walter Price, took one look at their group and started barking orders, getting the kids settled, checking everyone for bites and injuries. Marcus watched as Dr. Hayes worked alongside Walter, both of them falling into the familiar rhythm of emergency medical care, bringing some sense of normalcy to the insanity. But normalcy was an illusion because the radio chatter made it clear that the city was lost. Downtown was completely overrun, the bridges were blocked or destroyed to prevent the infection from spreading, and the National Guard was establishing a perimeter around the entire metropolitan area, not to rescue people inside but to keep the infection contained. They were trapped in a dead city with thousands of those creatures, and nobody was coming to save them. At Hendricks Tower, Jake had successfully led the entire group of survivors up to the rooftop using the elevator shaft ladder, a process that took almost 4 hours and nearly resulted in disaster when Brenda Phillips froze halfway up and had to be talked through a panic attack while dangling over a 100-foot drop. But they'd made it, all 30 of them, and now they were on the roof watching the sun set over a dying city. Jake had tried using the emergency radio from the helipad, broadcasting a distress call on every frequency he could find, but so far there'd been no response. They weren't alone on the rooftops though. Jake could see people on other tall buildings, some waving makeshift flags or using mirrors to signal, all of them stuck in the same situation, trapped above the nightmare below. As darkness fell, the city took on an eerie quality, the usual light pollution reduced to scattered fires and the occasional working street light. Jake organized the survivors into shifts, some keeping watch, some trying to rest, everyone rationing the limited food and water they'd scrounged from office break rooms. Roy had managed to get one of the rooftop access doors reinforced, sealing off the stairwell below, but they could still hear the creatures down there, an endless moaning that set everyone's nerves on edge. Tyler had found a working radio in the helipad equipment locker, and they listened to the emergency broadcasts, the official government line that the situation was under control, that people should remain calm and shelter in place, that help was on the way. But between the official broadcasts were pirate radio stations, people broadcasting from who knows where, telling the truth about cities falling, about millions dead or turned, about the government preparing to write off entire regions as lost causes. Chris, the tech guy, had an idea that gave everyone a glimmer of hope. He'd noticed that the building's satellite internet was still functioning, probably running on some backup power source that hadn't failed yet. If they could get to the communications room on the 58th floor, they might be able to get online, send messages, coordinate with other survivors, maybe even reach someone who could actually help them. The problem was that going back down into the building meant going back toward those things, but sitting on the roof slowly dying of thirst and starvation wasn't exactly a great alternative. Jake volunteered to go, figuring it was his responsibility as security, and was surprised when Brenda insisted on coming with him. The lawyer who'd frozen on the ladder wanted to prove to herself that she wasn't a coward, that she could be useful. Jake admired the courage that took and agreed, and Roy joined them because he knew where the communications room was and how to access it. The three of them descended back into the building through the roof access, and the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees as soon as they left the open air. They moved cautiously, using flashlights sparingly, trying to stay quiet even though the creatures probably already knew they were there. The building was different at night, shadows everywhere, the emergency lighting creating pockets of red illumination separated by darkness. They made it down 2 floors without incident, and Jake was starting to think they might actually pull this off when they rounded a corner and ran straight into a group of 5 creatures. There was no time to think, only react, and Jake swung the crowbar he'd been carrying, catching the first one in the temple and dropping it instantly. Roy had a pipe wrench and used it to devastating effect, while Brenda, armed with a heavy flashlight, went for the legs, trying to knock them down so the men could finish them. They won the fight, but barely, and Brenda had a long scratch down her arm from where one of the creatures had grabbed her. Jake examined it carefully, his heart sinking, but it was just a scratch, no broken skin, no bite, and they all breathed a little easier. The communications room was right where Roy said it would be, and miracle of miracles, the equipment was still functional. Chris had given them a flash drive with a program that would automatically send out distress calls with their location to every government agency, military installation, and emergency service within digital reach. Jake plugged it in and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, willing it to go faster, all too aware that every second they spent in this building increased their chances of not making it back to the roof. The program finished, the distress calls went out, and Jake was about to suggest they haul ass back upstairs when the radio in the communications room crackled to life. A voice came through, military by the sound of it, crisp and professional. "Hendricks Tower, this is Colonel Matthews with the Michigan National Guard. We've received your distress call and are confirming survivors at your location. Be advised, we have multiple survivor groups throughout the city, and we are planning evacuation operations, but we need to secure a landing zone first. What is your rooftop situation? Can you receive helicopters?" Jake grabbed the radio so fast he almost dropped it, his hands shaking as he responded, giving the colonel all the information about their group, their supplies, their situation. The colonel's response was cautious but encouraging. They were on the list, evacuations would begin within 48 hours, they needed to hold out and maintain rooftop security until then. 48 hours. 2 days. Jake thought about their water situation, their food, the 30 people counting on him, and he made a promise to that colonel that they'd be ready. The 3 of them made their way back to the roof, moving even more carefully now that they had something to lose, now that rescue wasn't just a fantasy. When they emerged onto the rooftop and Jake shared the news, the relief was palpable, and several people actually cried. They had a deadline, a goal, something to survive for, and that made all the difference. They organized better defenses, rationed supplies more carefully, and set up a watch rotation to keep the rooftop secure. The night was long and filled with the sounds of the dying city below, but they made it to sunrise, and that was a victory. Back at Danny's house in Riverside Park, the group had survived their first night, but it had been close. 3 separate attacks, small groups of creatures drawn by noise or lights or just random chance, each one repelled but at the cost of ammunition they couldn't spare. Danny's stockpile was impressive, but it wasn't infinite, and if they kept burning through ammo at this rate, they'd be defenseless within a week. Marcus Thompson proposed a different strategy. They needed to get out of the suburbs, head somewhere more defensible, maybe even try to reach the National Guard perimeter they'd heard about on the radio. The idea sparked a heated debate, with some people arguing that moving was suicide, that the house was safe and they should stay put, while others agreed with Marcus that staying meant slowly running out of supplies until they had no choice but to leave, only weaker and more desperate. Amanda found herself siding with Marcus, maybe because she was a teacher and used to thinking long-term, used to planning for outcomes months down the line. They couldn't stay here forever, and better to move now while they still had resources and strength than wait until they were forced to. Lisa backed her up from a medical standpoint, pointing out that they had no real medical supplies, that any serious injury or illness could be a death sentence, and that reaching a National Guard medical station could save lives. Cassidy surprised everyone by agreeing with the adults, showing a maturity beyond her 16 years as she calmly laid out the supply calculations she'd been doing, proving mathematically that they had maybe 10 days of food and water if they were careful, less if more people joined them. Danny listened to all the arguments, and Amanda could see him struggling with it, his instinct to fortress up and defend fighting against his military training that told him defensive positions without resupply were death traps. Finally, he made the call. They'd leave at first light, take his truck and Marcus's SUV, head north toward the National Guard perimeter that the radio said was being established near the state line. They spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing, loading vehicles, planning routes, saying silent goodbyes to homes they'd probably never see again. Amanda took one last walk through her house, looking at the photos on the walls, the life she'd built, and tried not to think about how everything had gone to hell in less than 24 hours. They pulled out just as the sun was rising, 2 vehicles, 7 people including Marcus's wife Jennifer and their baby boy David, everything they could carry packed in tight. The streets of Riverside Park were a horror show in the morning light, bodies everywhere, abandoned cars, houses with doors torn open, and those things wandering aimlessly until something caught their attention. Danny drove the truck with Cassidy and Lisa, while Marcus drove the SUV with Jennifer, baby David, and Amanda. They'd agreed on a route that avoided main roads, stuck to suburban streets where they were less likely to run into massive crowds of the creatures, but even the side streets weren't exactly safe. They had to detour 3 times in the first 10 minutes, blocked by wrecks or large groups of zombies, and Amanda kept her rifle ready, watching every shadow, every movement. They were about 5 miles from the house when they encountered other survivors, a family stranded on the roof of their car, surrounded by maybe 20 of those things. Danny wanted to keep driving, argued that they couldn't save everyone, that every stop increased their risk, but Amanda couldn't leave them, couldn't drive past a family with little kids and just let them die. She convinced Marcus to stop, and they executed a quick rescue operation that was probably insane but somehow worked. Danny and Amanda provided covering fire from the vehicles while Marcus pulled the family into his SUV, 3 of them, parents and a 10-year-old boy, all terrified but alive. The rescue cost them ammunition and time and almost cost them Marcus when one of the creatures got too close, but they pulled it off, and Amanda felt like maybe they weren't completely losing their humanity in this nightmare. The National Guard perimeter was supposed to be at the state line, about 40 miles north, but they only made it 30 miles before running into the real perimeter, and it wasn't what they'd been hoping for. Military vehicles, razor wire, armed soldiers, and a massive crowd of survivors all pressed up against the barricades, thousands of people desperate to get through. Danny parked the truck well back from the crowd, and they approached on foot, trying to figure out what was happening. A National Guard sergeant, looking exhausted and at the end of his rope, explained the situation. The perimeter was closed, no one in or out, by order of the federal government. The entire metropolitan area was under quarantine, and they were establishing safe zones within the perimeter where survivors could be processed, checked for infection, and provided with food, water, and shelter. But they weren't letting anyone leave the quarantine zone because the brass was terrified of spreading the infection to unaffected areas. It wasn't the escape they'd hoped for, but a safe zone was better than being on their own, and they joined the line of survivors waiting to be processed. The wait was hours long, the sun beating down, baby David crying, everyone on edge. Amanda watched the soldiers manning the perimeter, saw the fear in their eyes despite their training, saw how they kept their weapons ready in their distance from the crowd. She couldn't blame them. If she'd been in their position, knowing that any one of these survivors could be infected, could turn at any moment, she'd be terrified too. The processing was thorough when they finally reached the front of the line. Visual examination for bites or scratches, temperature checks, questions about exposure to infected individuals. One family 3 groups ahead of them got pulled out of line when the father couldn't explain away a bandaged hand, his protests that it was just a cut from broken glass falling on deaf ears as soldiers escorted them away to what was called a medical observation area but felt more like a prison sentence. Their group made it through processing, all of them cleared, and they were directed to Safe Zone Echo, a fortified area set up in what used to be a shopping mall about 5 miles inside the perimeter. The mall was packed with survivors, thousands of them, all crammed into a space designed for commerce, not refugee housing. But there was food, actual hot food being served by Red Cross volunteers, and clean water, and medical care, and for the first time in 2 days, Amanda felt like maybe they were going to survive this. She found a corner in what used to be a bookstore, claimed it for their group, and literally collapsed from exhaustion, her body finally giving in now that they'd reached something resembling safety. At County General Hospital's Emergency Services building, Marcus and his group were facing a hard truth: they couldn't stay there. The building was surrounded, hundreds of those creatures drawn by the noise and activity of the survivors inside, and it was only a matter of time before they found a way in. Walter, the lead paramedic, had been in contact with the National Guard via radio, and they'd confirmed what Jake's group at Hendricks Tower had been told: evacuations were being planned, but it would take time, and the hospital district was considered extremely high risk because of the concentration of infected. They were looking at possibly a week before rescue, and Walter didn't think they had a week, not with the creatures testing the defenses every hour, not with their supplies running low. Dr. Hayes proposed an alternative. There was a CDC research facility about 10 miles east, a secured campus designed for infectious disease research, with real defenses, real supplies, and potentially people who could actually do something about this outbreak. Getting there would mean traveling 10 miles through an infected city with a group that included 12 children, but staying meant almost certain death. Marcus found himself, once again, volunteering for the dangerous option, maybe because he felt responsible for these kids after everything they'd been through, or maybe because sitting still waiting to die just wasn't in his nature. They planned the route carefully, using city maps and Walter's knowledge of the area from years of emergency services. They'd use 2 ambulances, armored vehicles designed to take abuse, and make a run for it in the early morning when the creatures seemed less active based on the patterns they'd observed. The convoy left just before dawn, 2 ambulances packed with survivors, Walter driving the lead vehicle with Marcus riding shotgun, Dr. Hayes driving the second with Travis and Michelle managing the kids in back. The city streets were an obstacle course of abandoned cars, debris, and wandering dead, but the ambulances were tough and Walter drove like a man possessed, ramming through obstacles, taking corners at speeds that made Marcus grip the dashboard. They were halfway to the CDC facility when they ran into a major problem: a massive group of those creatures, hundreds of them, maybe drawn by the sound of the ambulances or maybe just a horrible coincidence, blocking the entire road ahead. Walter slammed on the brakes, threw the ambulance in reverse, but the second ambulance with Dr. Hayes clipped an abandoned car and stalled out. Marcus watched in horror as the creatures surged toward the stalled ambulance, and he made a decision without thinking it through. He grabbed the shotgun from the rack, kicked open his door, and started firing, each blast dropping one of those things, drawing their attention away from the ambulance full of kids. Walter joined him, and together they created enough of a distraction for Dr. Hayes to get the ambulance restarted. Marcus was reloading when he felt something grab his ankle, looked down to see one of the creatures on the ground, its legs crushed but still functioning, still trying to pull him down. Walter's boot came down hard on its skull, and Marcus broke free, diving back into the ambulance as Walter punched the accelerator. They found an alternate route, adding 20 minutes to their journey but avoiding the massive horde, and when the CDC facility finally came into view, Marcus could have cried from relief. The facility was everything Dr. Hayes had promised: high walls, armed guards, functional power, and real organization. The security team at the gate was cautious but professional, checking everyone for infection before allowing them into the compound. Inside, they found a community of survivors, maybe 200 people, including actual CDC scientists who were working on understanding the outbreak. A virologist named Dr. Patricia Freeman gave them a briefing that was both enlightening and terrifying. The infection was viral, spread through bodily fluids like bites or scratches, with a 100% mortality rate followed by reanimation within 30 minutes to 2 hours. There was no cure, no vaccine, not yet, but they were working on it. The reanimated victims showed no higher brain function, operating on pure predatory instinct, attracted to noise and movement, and only terminal brain destruction would stop them permanently. Marcus and his group were integrated into the facility's community, given quarters, assigned duties, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus felt like he could breathe. He watched the kids from the hospital playing in a secured courtyard, supervised by volunteers, and thought about how close they'd all come to dying. Dr. Hayes was already working with the CDC team, her medical expertise valued, and Marcus found himself assigned to the security detail because of his experience fighting through the hospital. It wasn't the life he'd had before, but it was life, and that counted for something. On the rooftop of Hendrick's tower, Jake and his group were watching the horizon on the morning of the third day when they heard it: helicopters, multiple birds, coming in low and fast. Colonel Matthews had kept his promise, and Jake coordinated the landing, using flares to mark the safe area, keeping the survivors organized as the first Blackhawk touched down. The evacuation went smoothly, practiced efficiency as the National Guard crew loaded people in groups of 6, the helicopters lifting off and being replaced by others in rotation. Jake made sure he was on the last bird, standing on that rooftop with Tyler and Roy, watching as the final survivors boarded, refusing to leave until everyone else was safe. As his helicopter lifted off and banked away from the tower, Jake looked down at the city he'd lived in for 30 years and barely recognized it. Smoke and fire, empty streets, thousands of those creatures wandering aimlessly, and scattered groups of survivors on other rooftops, people they hadn't been able to reach yet but who hopefully would be next on the evacuation list. They touched down at a forward operating base set up in what used to be a regional airport, now transformed into a military installation processing thousands of refugees. Jake went through the same checks that Amanda's group had, the same questions, the same cautious treatment, and ended up in a refugee camp that was crowded and chaotic but safe. He was assigned to a tent with 5 other men, all survivors from different parts of the city, and they swapped stories late into the night, comparing horrors, sharing losses, trying to process the trauma. One guy had lost his entire family, another had watched his apartment building fall in a matter of hours, and Jake realized how lucky his group had been to make it out intact. In Safe Zone Echo at the mall, Amanda had settled into a new routine over the past week. She'd volunteered as a teacher for the kids in the camp, using her skills to provide some sense of normalcy for the children who'd lost so much. Danny and Cassidy were working security for the Safe Zone, his military experience making him valuable to the soldiers trying to maintain order. Marcus Thompson had turned his IT skills toward helping establish better communications between safe zones, while his wife Jennifer worked in the daycare helping with the babies and toddlers. Lisa was in the medical tent, her nursing skills desperately needed as people dealt with everything from chronic conditions without medication to injuries sustained during the outbreak. The routine was shattered when the announcement came over the PA system: all survivors were to assemble in the main courtyard for an important briefing from the National Guard commander. Thousands of people crowded into the space, and Amanda felt the tension, the fear that this was going to be bad news. General Morrison took the makeshift stage, a hard-looking woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who'd seen combat. Her words were direct, no sugarcoating. The infection had spread to 17 states, major cities were falling, the military was stretched impossibly thin, and the government was implementing emergency protocols to establish secure zones while abandoning areas that couldn't be held. The Detroit metropolitan area was being maintained as a quarantine zone, with survivors being relocated to more permanent facilities in less affected regions. They'd be moving out in convoys starting tomorrow, heading to a secured area in northern Michigan where a larger survivor community was being established. The news hit hard, the finality of it, the admission that their city was being written off, left to the dead. But there was also relief because relocation meant getting out of the hot zone, meant moving somewhere with better resources, better defenses, better chances of long-term survival. Amanda spent that evening packing the few possessions she'd managed to keep, helping the kids in her makeshift classroom do the same, and trying not to think too hard about the life she was leaving behind. The city where she'd been born, where she'd grown up, where she'd built her career and her life, was gone, and she had to accept that and move forward because that's what survivors did. The convoy north was massive, dozens of vehicles, military escorts, thousands of survivors, all moving together toward an uncertain future. Amanda rode in the back of a transport truck with her group from Riverside Park, and they watched through the canvas flap as the landscape rolled by, leaving the ruins of the city behind. They passed through small towns that had been fortified, saw survivors working to build new communities, saw military checkpoints every few miles maintaining security. It was a glimpse of what the world was becoming, scattered pockets of humanity fighting to survive, to rebuild, to not let the darkness win. The northern facility was built around an old state park, expanded and fortified into a proper settlement with housing, agriculture, industry, everything needed for long-term survival. It was organized chaos as new arrivals were processed, assigned housing, given job assignments based on their skills. Amanda was assigned to education, which made sense, and she found herself in charge of setting up a school for the children, giving them structure and learning and hope. Danny joined the security force, while Cassidy surprised everyone by wanting to work in agriculture, helping grow food for the community. The others in their group scattered to their own assignments, but they stayed in touch, bound together by what they'd survived. Marcus Washington from County General found himself at the CDC facility, which had become one of the premier research centers working on the infection. He transitioned from security to helping coordinate survivor intake, using his nursing skills and his experience to help newly arrived refugees adjust to life in the facility. Dr. Hayes and the other scientists made slow but steady progress on understanding the virus, and while a cure remained elusive, they developed better protocols for prevention and containment. Marcus watched the children he'd saved from the hospital grow up in the facility, saw them laugh and play and be kids despite everything they'd been through, and he counted that as a victory. Jake Morrison ended up at the northern facility same as Amanda's group, though they didn't meet for several months, the settlement being so large. He worked in logistics, using his organizational skills to help manage the supply chains that kept the community fed and functioning. He sometimes thought about those terrifying days on the rooftop, about the people he'd helped save, and felt proud that he'd kept his head when everything was falling apart. He'd lost his old life, but he'd gained a new purpose, and maybe that was enough. Months passed, then a year, and the world settled into a new reality. The infection hadn't been cured, hadn't been defeated, but it had been contained in most areas. Huge swaths of territory were still lost zones, cities full of the wandering dead, but humanity had adapted, survived, carved out spaces where life could continue. The northern facility grew into a proper town, thousands of people building lives, having children, planning for a future that had seemed impossible in those first dark days. Amanda stood in front of her classroom one morning, looking at the faces of her students, kids who'd never known the old world, who'd grown up in this new reality of secure zones and constant vigilance. She taught them math and science and literature, but also taught them hope, taught them that humanity had faced the darkness and refused to surrender, and that as long as they stood together, they could survive anything. The shadows had covered the city, had covered the world, but they hadn't covered everything, and in the places where lights still burned, humanity was fighting back, building back, refusing to give up. The struggle wasn't over, might never be truly over, but they were still here, still fighting, still human, and that meant everything.